In the meantime, please give them a very warm welcome, Nick and Claire.
Thank you. Did you want to start?
Cool, brilliant. So we're going to do a really visual kind of little presentation for you for about 15 minutes or so, talking about RIBA House of the Year 2023. So we're Nick and Claire. We're from Hayhurst Co Architects, based in London, and Greenhouse was described by the RIBA jury as an extraordinary, ordinary house. And so we're pleased to talk to you about some of that today. So these were some of the projects that we were up against to win that award. Some of them were massive bond-like layers in the Highlands of Scotland. Some of them were very kind of boutique-y pavilions on the Isle of Wight and very kind of chic places. Ours was a house for a photographer in Tottenham. And it was a 5-bedroomed house built for just over £500,000, which on one level sounds like a lot of money, but for the actually building a new house in today's market actually is pretty good, and it's a relatively kind of good value project. As architects, some of the other projects that we've done, we work a lot with the ideas of innovation, technical innovation, creativity, and really thinking about how people will use the homes and the buildings that we design. So this is Garden House that we designed a few years ago, also won an RIBA award. Greenhouse, as well as designing new builds, it's also about extensions and thinking about materials. Another house we designed a few years ago, and we also do kind of schools and commercial spaces. So as architects, we tend to be quite versatile in terms of the types of how we apply kind of our kind of creative technical skills to different types of buildings. Or the PowerPoint's gone a bit crazy with the setting out, but anyway. But as architects, I mean, we see ourselves, I suppose, as creative technical professionals. And what we do is that we synthesize kind of spatial and functional user experience and user requirements with constructional issues and legislative issues. And basically, we create one-off supersized built artifacts. And that's essentially what we do on a day-to-day basis. And we also work from every single scale to, you know, a component of a building, a door handle, right through to how they come together to create rooms, how they create buildings, and we're also interested in how those buildings kind of come together to create cities.
So I was project architect on this house, which was Greenhouse, which is the one that won House of the Year last year. So the site is in Tottenham, kind of back lane site in Tottenham. And what we always start with is kind of what's the concept, who's the client, and how do we kind of begin that process. So this was the context. It's a conservation area in Tottenham. The house that's on the site before is the beautiful monstrosity you can see on the right-hand side, and the client bought it with a view to kind of demolishing and building something, a kind of new sustainable house in its place. Other thing we kind of do on most sites, we'll look at the kind of the history and the context of the site and draw out the concept from that alongside bits and pieces from the client and understanding their personality. So this was a history of the site that actually was quite green historically. So even though now it's a lot of terraced houses, that was actually a back lane that used to be orchards and market gardens, and we wanted to draw on that character. So this is the site here, how it was, and there's this kind of area of landlocked woodland opposite, which is it's kind of like almost quite a rural feeling within quite an urban setting. And then the client, as Nick said before, there's a teacher and a photographer. This is the Instagram of Tom, who was the photographer. And yeah, it's just interesting to kind of, we worked quite collaboratively with him. He's obviously a creative individual as well, quite visual. And I think you'll see in the house kind of how some of his personality and his kind of aesthetic sensibilities came into the process. We worked quite a lot with him, and he also did quite a lot of making in the house as well. So we also have to deal with a lot of functional requirements. So they had a set brief of kind of what number of bedrooms, bathrooms they wanted, approximately living space. And then we start to put those together as to how, you know, how these work together with the space and how it all works with the concept and this idea of this house in a green landscape. And then when we went to visit the clients in the house previously, it was very green. They had pot plants everywhere, even though the house was a pretty miserable wreck. You know, that was kind of clearly part of the joy of how they like to live is this greenery. So we started to look at concepts with the clients. So kind of this idea of living in landscapes as spaces that are kind of fluid and feel like they might be indoors or outdoors, and that there's a connection between indoor and outdoor space that doesn't feel disconnected. There's a kind of visual connection as well as physical connection through. And then this was starting to look at how that might take shape into a building, so how living spaces might interact with each other. And we went through these kind of diagrams with the client to help them understand that. We also use quite a lot of references, so looking at previous houses, kind of things they've brought to us, as well as things that we're looking at in terms of helping them understand what the building might be eventually and giving them some kind of tangible idea. And then we also look at things like, obviously, practical things like daylighting, sunlighting, views out, as we're trying to put those spaces together and make sure they're in keeping with this concept. So the idea of the views here, that's kind of the idea is every single living space had a view out to landscape and greenery. And then we also think a bit about sustainability, how the daylight comes in, how the ventilation works in the building. So there's a lot of practical considerations that go alongside the kind of concept. And then we wanted it to be something that was really unusual and was kind of really shouted this kind of green, verdant idea, and rather than just fitting in with what was around it. So this was the kind of early concept drawing of how those kind of green house might come together in this central space that was semi-indoor, semi-outdoor, and then landscape either side.
So after we managed to get planning consent in 8 weeks, which is not always the case in London, we began the kind of the technical process of beginning to put the space together in more detail, and thinking about the kind of how the construction we put together, and also in more detail about how those relationships between the history, the site, the greening, would all kind of synthesize and gel together to form the house that we're going to talk about just now. One of the key things that we do, and you can see where the blue arrow is here, is think about the user experience and the views through a building or through a set of spaces. And so this being the view kind of from the street through a fairly kind of rickety fence through to the building. But then also when you're kind of thinking about it as a sequence of spaces kind of walking through, and this is one of my favorite photos, talking about the kind of the layering of space and the layering of use of different materials. So the curtain here, we've got the cross-laminated timber, which is the CLT, which is the frame of the building, which is really good from an embodied carbon and sustainability point of view, because it's what's called sequesters carbon. And then also kind of these snippets of views, both upwards and also out to the garden. And so what we're trying to do in putting together some of the plans and the drawings that we do, we're almost all the time thinking what's the three-dimensionality of the space that we're creating, and how does that work? How do we create views that look forward? So this is the main atrium space, kind of looking through to the back, and then also looking through to the front and into their little kitchen space. And then views upwards and kind of through the house, and with all the planting. And also we quite curated the kind of the colour palette of both with the timber, with the plants, with the curtains, and with all these pieces together. And then this is the view out towards the back of the garden, kind of trying to emphasise this idea of an urban oasis, and thinking about that relationship, all the things that the client talked about at the very beginning, and how they embedded into back into the design process. That's the couple's 2 sons, and that kind of that relationship in the green of greenhouse, and then the curtains. And then as we go upstairs, into the kind of the gallery space, and then through to some of the site photos.
So yeah, just a bit about the kind of practicalities. This, as Nick said, is a cross-laminated timber building. So these panels were all made off-site. In fact, they came over from Germany on a lorry during COVID and just before Brexit. So just got in before any issues with duties. And they kind of this all went up within 10 days on site. So it's all made in a factory and then brought in. And it's got a fire treatment over the surface of it. And then that's what you see as the finished face of the building. So it's all quite simple in terms of materials. And we kind of like to expose bits of the materials throughout the house to kind of understand how the building's made. And some of these details are a bit unusual, and some of the suppliers are a bit nervous about them, but luckily we had a client who wanted to take some kind of risks and experiment with materials in unusual ways. So this is the door just cut straight out of the structural wall panel. And then the kind of greening that we talked about before, the whole facade is planted. It's planted with bamboo, which creates this kind of green views out from the upstairs spaces and downstairs. And it also provides shading and privacy screens, so without having to have kind of net curtains or anything. And it means you always have this view out to greenery no matter what level you're on, and also has the kind of this privacy screen. And there's polycarbonate over the facade, and these panels, I think, yeah. So There's the section through the front facade with the green shading, and then there's this polycarbonate screen on the outside, which you can completely close off to kind of provide a complete privacy without needing to block out all the light. And it gives you this kind of little private view into your own little tropical oasis from your bedroom as well. This was some tests that we did. So in order to kind of communicate this to the client as we were developing it, we did some tests in the office with plants and different types of polycarbonate and screening and materials as to how that would work. And then the image on the right is kind of finished view back into the bedrooms. And then this is a bit about how the screens slide across. It's kind of these big jumbo external curtains. And then a view at night, this is quite a cool effect where the whole building sort of glows. This view from the street. And then this is quite nice to go back, because this is a couple of years after it was finished, so the garden's really grown up, and it's kind of, continue the landscape into the back garden as well. Also it's always really fun to kind of discover unexpected uses and benefits of the design. So it's a really good party house, it's quite interesting to see how the clients have used the space differently. And we've also discovered things like, that the little walkway makes a great stage for kids' parties. So it's really good to always go back and kind of understand how the client's using the spaces and unexpected uses. So these were a couple of quotes from the RIBA jury. So we kind of affectionately refer to it as the Tottenham riad. So the idea is that it provides this kind of green oasis within the city, and it's this big kind of airy space, but actually the materials are quite warm and quite soft. And actually, even though it's very different from its neighbours, it still fits into it. So some of the kind of more boring, but still maybe interesting practicalities. So I think it was built relatively quickly. So as Nick said, it got planning within 8 weeks. The whole process of design to completion was about 2.5 years, I think. And it was completed on site in 8 months. The cost was pretty stable all the way through. It only went up by a few £1,000s, and it was built for under £3,000 a square metre, which I think is testament to a good working relationship with the client. They were very decisive. They didn't change their mind. They didn't add in things. They kind of trusted us to deliver it and deal with the builders. And also the cross-laminated timber frame that went up very quickly and kind of could be built off-site whilst the groundworks and everything were being done. It's also worth noting everything we do is a very big team effort. It's never just one person that does a sketch and then it magically appears. So we worked very closely with the clients, and then within the office there was a team of several of us. The builder, obviously, they brought a lot to the table as well in terms of detailing and how things are put together. Worked with structural engineer, also the sustainability, the timber contractor, and so it's always quite a collaborative effort.
There you go.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, congratulations. That is fantastic. I do have a quick question. I always wonder when I see these things, you see them on telly, it looks like it's built in a fairly normal area. So what does everyone else think when it goes up and suddenly they look at their house and go, oh. Do you get calls, inundated calls with builders, one like that?
No, I mean, I think there's 2 points where it happens. One is a planning process, and then one is obviously at the very end of the project. And what was really interesting is that the existing house that was there was so awful that it set the baseline at a very low level. Not to be entirely blunt about it. And so when it went through the planning process, there were no representations from other neighbours or from other people. And also as a kind of an act of sign of collaboration, one of the owners, Tom, had basically had sweet talked, I think, all of the neighbours. He'd fixed their sinks, bought them wine, and so there's a great community message and act in terms of a kind of making that happen. I think in terms of when it's complete, I think there's a moment of a slight moment of awe, I think, more than anything else. And because it's down a bit of a quiet lane, it's not on a busy main road. It is a bit more of you can walk past and not entirely notice it. So it is a bit more subtle in that context.
And wine is always a good way to make sure that you...
Always.
Look, please do have a think about questions. I think you mentioned there, one of the things I was going to ask was the collaboration piece, and we spoke about this when we caught up before. You're working with quite a creative person in the first instance, so how do you approach that? And I'm sure many people can relate in this room when we are working, I guess, in a very creative industry and very creative people, they tend to have their own ideas.
Yeah.
How do you What's the process when you're dealing with someone like that to make sure that they are listening to, so you end up with the result that you've just shown us?
I think it depends on the client quite a lot. I think in this instance, obviously they had their own ideas and priorities, but they came to us with a kind of list of, we want high ceilings, we want this number of bedrooms, we want connection to nature, we want this. They weren't specific, like, I've had an idea and this is what it's going to be. I think actually because he's creative and other people trust him as a photographer to kind of do a shoot how he thinks it's the right way of doing it, he felt the same with us. So we said, you're the architects, this is my brief, and let us kind of do what we wanted with it. And I think that way they were.
But it also had quite a low budget. And
yes.
so he recounted several tales of when he's on a commercial shoot, wherever it is in the world, for a particular kind of company or firm. He's saying quite often that he thinks his best creative work is when he's given a very tight budget, and said that you've got to work creatively to deliver what we want to deliver, but within this kind of frame. And what he said, and he made the parallel with us, in that he says, you know, I'm not going to pinch your fee, you know, or to try and kind of whittle you down in terms of what I'm paying you, because I almost want to pay you more to deliver, you know, what can be done as well as possible within the overall budget framework that I have, and he kind of understanding that process. So I think there's a bit of a leap of faith that a client has to take, kind of in trusting that process.
Mm. Do we have any questions?
Lots.
Straight away over there. There is no mic run, so I'm going to have to double up.
I think my daughter's showing like a natural inclination towards architecture. She plays this game when we go out for walks where she has to imagine like a building and kind of create it from the inside and out. She's only 10, so a long way to go before she can be in your shoes. But I just wondered, it's really difficult, isn't it, with everything changing, technology and AI, but I wondered if there's any advice you could give me for things that I might do to encourage her in that direction if she's got a natural talent.
I would say encourage hand drawing, hand sketching. Still a lot of what we do is felt tip pens and drawings around a table, and I don't think one should lose sight of that skill and that kind of core kind of skill of what we do. I also just think actually cities, you know, buildings, especially in London, there's tons and tons of exhibitions, you know, about art and design and architecture.
Yeah, I suppose just going to maybe unusual buildings and stuff that, you know, that's not just kind of what she sees every day, I guess. And again, in London, there's a lot of opportunity to do that. Yeah.
I know we had another question. I'd come to you. I was just going to pick up on something that you said there, because the theme of this event is very much around bringing creativity back into what we do here in media. As creatives yourself, do you find that there is, technology obviously improves a lot of things and it does a lot of good. Is there a frustration sometimes that we become too reliant on the technology? Just picking up your point where you said don't lose sight of those simple things that I get the creative juices flowing.
I think technology is a tool to help you do what you do better. I don't think it replaces the act of the creative discipline of synthesizing these sets of issues or things together. So I think, and it helps you communicate it more clearly. So the idea that we can produce, we didn't do with this project because of the time that we did it in 2019-20, but now, only 3 or 4 years later, on a similar project, we would be doing walkthroughs, you know, with a client at design stage, kind of so that they can literally walk through their house. That doesn't. But I think also sometimes you can fall into a false sense of security because technology makes it all right. But sometimes it's the core, you know, you can do a whiz-bang 3D walkthrough, go, oh, it's amazing, it's great. But that, it doesn't necessarily mean it is all right, it just looks all right. So I think it can help people give confidence, but I don't think it takes away from the core act of what, as a creative synthesis of different things people do.
Okay, I'll give you the mic.
So I run your business, so I'm fascinated about how you pitch and also how architecture's managed to not become a commodity, you know, like media is heading towards.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. Different architects work in different markets. So we do people's houses. We do schools and work with local authorities. We also work with some commercial clients on retrofits. So in terms of new business, it's quite difficult because on some of our clients, they will only ever appoint people once, and it's a one-time event. Whereas sometimes with local authorities or with commercial clients where we're doing a fit out of multiple spaces, then we're in a system. And so what's very time consuming for us is when we're pitching to people who we know will only ever appoint us once. And quite often, so half the time we have to produce something and half the time we don't. So I mean, especially now that we've been in practice for 20 years, we can sit and say, look, this is our back portfolio. We don't need to do anything much else to prove it. And I think it's much more difficult for younger practices who don't have that catalogue of however many built projects behind them and awards and what have you to be able to do that. So I think the type of new business you have to do varies quite a lot depending on how established you are kind of in the market. I don't know whether that was, but it's, yeah.
I think we can squeeze one. I saw a hand go, oh, Lee. Our friend Lee.
I found that absolutely fascinating. I think one of the points that Steve made was around how you're working with that particular client. You're blessed that you had a creative client there. How do you deal with conflict when you deal with someone who potentially isn't as creative-minded? And I'm thinking in the world that we live in, often procurement might be a department that we have to work with who do not place necessarily the credence on creativity and innovative thinking because they're just looking at a line on a spreadsheet. Yep. How do you overcome that, and how do you overcome that conflict that might come up when you're dealing with clients who potentially aren't as open and creatively minded?
It's a tough one. And for all public sector work and for some commercial sector work, going through those procurement processes takes up a lot of our time and is a headache. In most cases, we won't do anything or we won't bid for anything which is less than 60-40 quality to fee. So if it's a 50-50, in terms of how it's going to be evaluated against commercials versus quality, we probably won't go for it because we know, to be frank, we're probably on the upper. We're probably more expensive than average. We're not the highest, but we're more expensive than average. And we know that if it's on if they're 40% or 50% quality, we need to be able to make sure that when we bid, that our quality will override any deficit in the commercials. So we're quite particular about who we bid for and what their value is. And I think in many cases we're reliant on project managers or clients within organisations that will champion design and design quality and what that does for whether it's a local authority and social value or whether it's to do with sustainability rather than just the line on the spreadsheet. I mean, if it was 100% fee, we wouldn't even look at it because someone else will always come in with a kamikaze fee, and then what can you do?
I mean, I would say that there is on projects where there's always some level of conflict that you have to deal with. So a few things on this project that they didn't quite trust us on or weren't quite sure about that we had to kind of convince them of as well. And I think depending on who the client is, it's also understanding, trying to unpick why they want something a certain way. So they might say, oh, I want it like this, but actually it's an aspect of, so for example, they wanted really high ceilings, and we had this thing where we excavated it down, and they were not sure about the level change and separating the space. And we wanted to, we said it needs to be kind of a bit separate, otherwise it feels like one big space. You need to have this kind of cosy dining space in the middle. And when you kind of explain that process and our thinking behind it, sometimes that helps to bring them on board and to try to unpick what they mean. So sometimes I'll show an image and say, oh, we like this. And we like this, and they're completely different. And it could be that they like the staircase in one and the colour of the curtains in another or something. So you have to try and unpick that to understand that, to bring them along. And I think sometimes it is, I think that there is always some conflict on some levels of project. I mean, in this one, those things eventually, the things said they didn't like at the beginning, by the end they said, oh yeah, we're really glad we did it. But yeah, I think it's kind of just trying to understand them, which is anything else.
Well, look, we are very much nearly out of time. The last thing I think would be great if we could leave the room with, if there was one thing, and we've got up here around whether it's creative planning, working with sometimes easy clients, sometimes difficult clients, and innovative thinking, that you take into every project? If out of one of those three things, if you could pick one, what would that one be, and what would that bit of advice be?
I think in terms of innovative thinking, I mean, we have an approach where you like to misuse materials. We like to misuse things. So normally, things like, for example, at Greenhouse, we had the black cladding on the outside. I mean, that is the cheapest, that's agricultural grade cladding that you see it all across the country. You don't normally put it
Barns,
on
yeah.
you don't normally in barns, you don't normally see it in houses in a London. And so quite often what we're doing is we're trying to we call it misusing materials, and you taking things that are used for one application and using them for a different application, and mixing and matching it up to see what happens. So I think innovative thinking for us is about technology, about materials, and trying to think of a way in which we can use something creatively each time.
It's kind of level of the unexpected as well in that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's the level of the unexpected to kind of do something unusual, and I think it's always nice to kind of surprise a client and not do if they say we want this, 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 and this, to kind of just give them something they didn't quite expect. It's always, I think, a winner generally.
Brilliant. Well, look, we are out of time. We probably could ask half a dozen more questions, but for now, please give Claire and Nick a very warm round of applause.